My name is Sergeant Michael O'Brien, and I've carried this story in my chest for over 80 years now. Every night when I close my eyes, I'm back there in the humid darkness of Guadalcanal, August 1942, watching something that defied everything I thought I knew about war, about death, about what men could endure. I was 22 then, leading a squad of Marines in the 1st Marine Division. We'd been on that godforsaken island for 3 weeks, fighting the Japanese inch by bloody inch through jungles so thick you couldn't see the sky. The heat was like a living thing pressing down on us, making our uniforms stick to our skin like wet cement. But it wasn't the heat that kept us awake at night, it was the sounds. The jungle never slept, and neither did the enemy. Our squad was dug in along what the brass called Hill 123, overlooking a muddy creek that snaked through the valley below. The locals had called it something in their language, but the Marines renamed it Alligator Creek after Johnson from Chicago swore he saw a 12-foot gator lurking in the murky water. Whether there were actual alligators or not, we all knew there were worse things than reptiles in those waters. My boys were good men. There was Tommy Red Sullivan from Boston, barely 19 but steady as a rock with that bar of his. Frank Martinez from New Mexico, our best marksman, could thread a needle at 300 yards. Big Jim Patterson from Iowa, built like a barn and twice as tough. Pete Kowalski from Detroit, always cracking jokes even when we were hip-deep in mud and misery. And finally there was Eddie Park, our radio man, a quiet kid from Oregon who joined up right after Pearl Harbor, same as most of us. We'd been hearing rumors for days. Intelligence said the Japanese were massing for a big push, trying to retake Henderson Field. The Navy boys had spotted ships moving in the darkness, and our patrols reported unusual activity in the jungle. But nothing could have prepared us for what we witnessed that night. It started around 2,300 hours. I was on watch, scanning the creek below through my binoculars, when I saw the first glint of metal in the moonlight. I nudged Red, who was supposed to be sleeping but was picking at his K-rations instead. "Movement down by the creek," I whispered. "Wake the others, quiet like." Within minutes, my whole squad was alert, weapons ready, eyes straining into the darkness. What we saw emerging from the jungle on the far side of the creek made my blood run cold. It wasn't just the number of them, though there had to be at least 200 Japanese soldiers moving through the trees like ghosts. It was the way they moved. Mechanical. Precise. Like they were all connected by invisible strings. "Jesus Christ," Pete whispered beside me. "Look at them go." The Japanese forces were crossing the creek in perfect formation, their rifles held high above their heads. Even from our position 300 yards away I could see that something was wrong. They weren't taking cover, weren't being cautious. They were walking upright through waist-deep water like they were on parade. "Sarge," Eddie hissed, "should I call it in?" I was about to tell him yes when the first volley of machine gun fire erupted from the Marine positions downstream. The .30 caliber guns opened up like thunder, muzzle flashes lighting up the night like deadly fireworks. I watched through my binoculars as the bullets found their marks, watched Japanese soldiers stumble and fall into the muddy water. But then something happened that I still can't explain, even all these years later. The soldiers who had been hit, they got back up. Not all of them, but enough to make my hands shake as I held those binoculars. They climbed out of the water, their uniforms torn and bloody, and kept advancing. Did you see that? Frank Martinez was lying prone next to me, his Springfield trained on the creek below. I swear I saw that one take a round right in the chest. "You're seeing things," Big Jim muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. We were all seeing the same impossible thing. The machine guns kept firing and more Japanese soldiers fell. But with each volley more of them seemed to rise again, water and blood streaming from their wounds. They began to advance up the hill toward the Marine positions, and that's when we heard it, a sound that still echoes in my nightmares. It wasn't a battle cry or a shout. It was more like breathing. Heavy, labored breathing that seemed to come from everywhere at once. And underneath it, a low humming like the sound of power lines in a storm. The Japanese soldiers were humming as they advanced, all of them in perfect unison, creating a noise that made my teeth ache. "Sarge," Red's voice was tight with fear. "What the hell is that sound?" I didn't have an answer. I'd been in combat for 3 weeks, seen men die in ways that would haunt me forever, but this was different. This was wrong in a way that went deeper than war, deeper than killing. This was like watching the world break. The Japanese force reached the 1st Marine foxhole, and what happened next defied everything I thought I knew about warfare. The Marines, good men I'd trained with, shared chow with, opened fire at point-blank range. I saw muzzle flashes, heard the sharp crack of rifles, watched Japanese soldiers jerk and spin as bullets tore through them. But they kept coming. Even with half their faces blown away, even with their uniforms soaked in blood, they kept advancing. One soldier took a direct hit from a .45 pistol at maybe 10 feet. The bullet knocked him backward, and I saw the exit wound bloom across his back like a dark flower. He lay still for maybe 5 seconds, then pushed himself upright and continued forward. "They're not dying," Pete whispered, his voice cracking. "Jesus Christ, Sarge, they're not dying." The Marines downstream were screaming now, not battle cries but sounds of pure terror. I could hear Lieutenant Morrison shouting orders, but his voice was nearly drowned out by that awful humming and the continuous rattle of gunfire. The Japanese soldiers moved through the Marine positions like they were walking through tall grass, methodically bayoneting anyone they found. That's when I made the decision that saved our lives and damned my conscience forever. I grabbed Eddie's radio and called for artillery fire on our own positions. "Fire control, this is Bravo Squad. Request immediate fire mission, grid 234 to 567. Danger close, repeat, danger close." The voice on the other end was crackling with static. "Bravo Squad, did you say danger close?" "That's right, on top of Alpha Company." "Affirmative, control. Fire for effect. Do it now." I didn't wait for confirmation. I threw down the radio and shouted at my men. "Move. Everyone off the hill now." We grabbed our gear and ran. Behind us, the sounds of battle were growing fainter, replaced by that terrible humming. As we crashed through the jungle, I could hear the whistle of incoming artillery. The first shells hit just as we reached the bottom of the hill, and the explosions lit up the night like dawn. We kept running until we reached the secondary defensive line 2 miles back. I'll never forget the look on Captain Morrison's face when we stumbled into his command post, covered in mud and wild-eyed with terror. "O'Brien? What the hell happened up there? Where's the rest of your company?" I tried to explain, but the words came out wrong. How do you tell a career Marine that you witnessed something that couldn't exist? How do you explain that you called in artillery on your own men because the enemy wouldn't die? "Japanese assault, sir. Overran our positions. Had to call in fire to stop them." It wasn't a lie exactly. Just not the whole truth. The whole truth was something I knew no one would believe, something that would get me shipped to a psychiatric hospital if I ever spoke it aloud. The artillery barrage lasted for 20 minutes. When it was over, the reconnaissance teams found nothing but craters and scattered equipment. No bodies, Japanese or American. It was like everyone had simply vanished into the mud and smoke. The official report listed it as a successful defensive action against a Japanese night attack. 37 Marines were listed as missing in action, presumed killed. I was commended for my quick thinking in calling for fire support. They gave me a Bronze Star and a promotion to Staff Sergeant. But I knew what I'd seen. And in the weeks that followed, I wasn't the only one. Other Marines began reporting similar incidents. Japanese soldiers who took fatal wounds but kept fighting. Attacks that seemed to come from nowhere and vanish just as quickly. Men who swore they'd killed the same enemy soldier multiple times. The brass called it combat fatigue. Shell shock. They rotated men out, brought in fresh troops, and the reports stopped. But the experiences didn't. They just stopped being reported. I spent the rest of the war in the Pacific, fighting island to island until the surrender in Tokyo Bay. I was at Iwo Jima, saw the flag raising, watched thousands of good men die for yards of volcanic sand. But nothing I experienced in the rest of the war compared to that night at Alligator Creek. After the war, I tried to find the other survivors from my squad. Red Sullivan had been killed at Saipan in 1944. Frank Martinez made it home but died in a car accident in 1947. Big Jim Patterson became a farmer in Iowa, married his high school sweetheart, and never spoke about the war to anyone. Pete Kowalski disappeared entirely, no records, no family, like he'd never existed. Eddie Park, our radio man, spent 30 years in and out of psychiatric hospitals before taking his own life in 1975. I was the only one left who remembered. For decades, I told myself it had been a hallucination. Combat stress, exhaustion, the mind playing tricks in the heat and darkness of jungle warfare. I married a good woman, raised 3 children, worked as a police officer in my hometown of Cleveland. I lived a normal life and pushed those memories deep down where they couldn't hurt me. But memories have a way of surfacing, especially as you get older. And in 1987, something happened that brought it all back. I was reading the newspaper over breakfast when I saw a small article buried on page 6. Japanese war remains discovered in Pacific. The article was brief, describing how construction workers on Guadalcanal had discovered a mass grave containing the remains of Japanese soldiers. What caught my attention wasn't the discovery itself. War graves were still being found throughout the Pacific, but one particular detail. The remains showed signs of multiple bullet wounds, but forensic analysis suggested the wounds had been inflicted after death. The Japanese government had requested the remains be repatriated, but there was a problem. The soldiers couldn't be identified because their dog tags and personal effects were missing. More strangely, many of the remains showed signs of what the article called unusual preservation, despite having been buried for over 40 years. I stared at that article for a long time, remembering the humming, the way those soldiers had moved through the water like they were being pulled by invisible strings. Then I folded the paper, threw it in the trash, and tried to forget about it again. But I couldn't. That night, I called the number listed in the article and spoke to Dr. Sarah Chin, the anthropologist who was studying the remains. I told her I was a veteran who had fought on Guadalcanal, that I might have information about the soldiers they'd found. "Mr. O'Brien," she said, "I'm glad you called. We've been trying to piece together what happened to this unit. The forensic evidence is unusual. Would you be willing to meet with me?" We met at a coffee shop in downtown Cleveland. Dr. Chin was a small, intense woman in her 30s, with the kind of focused energy that reminded me of the intelligence officers I'd known during the war. She spread photographs across the table between us, black and white images of bones and artifacts. "These soldiers were part of the 29th Infantry Regiment," she explained. "They were reported missing in action in August 1942, somewhere in the vicinity of what your Marines called Alligator Creek." I felt my coffee cup trembling in my hands. "What makes you think I know anything about them?" "According to the military records, your unit was operating in that area during the time period when these soldiers disappeared. You called in an artillery strike on August 23, 1942. The impact zone corresponds almost exactly with where we found the remains." I set down my coffee cup and looked at the photographs. Even as bleached bone, there was something unsettling about those skeletons. They were arranged in perfect rows, like they'd been standing in formation when they died. And the skulls. The skulls all faced the same direction toward what would have been the Marine positions. "Dr. Chin," I said carefully, "what exactly are you trying to find out?" She leaned forward, her eyes intense. "Mr. O'Brien, I've examined over 200 sets of remains from the Pacific Theater. These are different. The bone density is wrong. The preservation is impossible. And there are traces of chemicals we can't identify. Chemicals. Compounds that don't exist in nature. Synthetic materials that weren't invented until the 1960s. But these soldiers died in 1942. She paused, watching my face. "What did you see that night, Mr. O'Brien?" I looked at her for a long moment, this young woman who was asking me to relive the most terrifying experience of my life. I thought about Red Sullivan, about Frank Martinez, about Eddie Park in his psychiatric hospital. I thought about the 37 Marines who had vanished into the mud and smoke of Alligator Creek. "I saw men who wouldn't die," I said. Finally. "I saw the enemy take wounds that should have killed them and they kept fighting. I saw things that night that couldn't exist, and I called in artillery on my own men to stop it." Dr. Chin didn't look surprised. She pulled out a tape recorder and set it on the table. "Would you be willing to tell me the whole story? Everything you remember?" I told her everything. The crossing of the creek, the humming, the way the Japanese soldiers moved like puppets on strings. The sound of breathing that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The Marines screaming in terror as they faced an enemy that couldn't be killed. The decision to call in the artillery strike that saved my squad and condemned everyone else. When I finished, Dr. Chin turned off the recorder and sat back in her chair. "Mr. O'Brien, I'm going to share something with you that's classified. In 1943, Allied intelligence discovered evidence that the Japanese had been experimenting with chemical compounds designed to enhance soldier performance. Drugs that could suppress pain, increase endurance, and delay the effects of blood loss. Drugs? Synthetic compounds based on traditional herbal remedies. The project was called Yamato Damashii, the spirit of Japan. The idea was to create soldiers who could fight beyond normal human limits." She paused. "The project was shut down in 1943 after a series of incidents that were covered up by both sides." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. What kind of incidents? Soldiers who wouldn't stop fighting even after sustaining fatal wounds. Units that seemed to operate with a collective consciousness. Reports of Japanese forces displaying behavior that defied conventional understanding of human physiology. She met my eyes. "What you saw that night, Mr. O'Brien, wasn't supernatural. It was science. Horrific, unethical science, but science nonetheless. But they were dead. I saw them die and get back up. Not dead. Chemically sustained beyond the point where normal human beings would have lost consciousness. The compounds kept their nervous systems functioning even after massive tissue damage. From a distance, in the darkness, it would have looked like the dead rising to fight again. I thought about the humming, the way they'd moved in perfect unison. And the sound they made? Side effect of the drugs. The compounds affected the respiratory system, created a kind of harmonic resonance when multiple subjects were under their influence. Dr. Chen closed her files. Mr. O'Brien, you didn't face the supernatural that night. You faced human beings who had been transformed into something else entirely. Something that shouldn't have existed. I left that coffee shop with more questions than answers. Dr. Chen's explanation made sense from a scientific standpoint, but it didn't make the memories any less terrifying. If anything, knowing that humans had deliberately created such horrors made it worse. In the years that followed, I tried to research the Yamato Damashii project myself. I found hints and fragments, references buried in declassified documents and forgotten military reports. Stories of Japanese soldiers displaying unusual resilience in the final years of the war. American intelligence reports describing enemy units that seemed to operate beyond normal human limitations. But the full story remained classified, locked away in government archives that might never be opened. Dr. Chen published her findings in obscure academic journals, but the mainstream historical narrative remained unchanged. The Battle of Guadalcanal was remembered as a conventional military engagement, a turning point in the Pacific War won through superior tactics and American courage. The truth, that both sides had witnessed something that challenged the very nature of warfare, was buried beneath layers of classification and official denial. The men who had been there, who had seen what I had seen, were either dead or too traumatized to speak. The secret died with them. I'm 97 years old now and I don't have much time left. My children think I'm starting to lose my mind, that the stories I tell about the war are the confused ramblings of an old man. Maybe they're right. Maybe decades of carrying this secret have finally broken something in my brain. But I know what I saw that night at Alligator Creek. I saw human beings transformed into something that shouldn't exist, something that could absorb wounds that would kill a normal man and keep fighting. I saw the future of warfare, a glimpse of what happens when science is pushed beyond moral boundaries in the name of victory. And I saw 37 good Marines disappear into the mud and smoke because I made the hardest decision of my life. I called in artillery on my own men to stop something that couldn't be stopped any other way. I saved my squad and condemned everyone else, and I've lived with that choice for 80 years. The official records list those Marines as missing in action. Their families received folded flags and letters expressing the nation's gratitude for their sacrifice. But I know the truth. They didn't die fighting for their country. They died because their country's science had created an enemy that couldn't be defeated by conventional means. Sometimes in the quiet hours before dawn, I still hear that humming. The sound of human beings pushed beyond the limits of what humans should be, transformed into something that could absorb bullets and keep fighting. And I remember the last thing I saw before the artillery struck. Rows of figures moving through the smoke, no longer quite human, driven by chemicals and patriotism and something that might have been science but felt like dark magic. They kept charging, like they couldn't die. And maybe, in the way that mattered most, they couldn't. The world has moved on. The war is ancient history now, studied by people who weren't there, understood through the lens of strategy and politics and national interest. But I was there. I saw what humanity is capable of when pushed to the very edge of survival. I saw what happens when the line between life and death becomes blurred by chemistry and desperation. And I know that somewhere, in classified files and secret laboratories, people are still working to create soldiers who can fight beyond human limits. The Yamato Damashii project may have ended in 1943, but the dream of the perfect warrior, the soldier who cannot be stopped, cannot be killed, cannot be defeated, that dream lives on. I pray that I'm wrong. I pray that the horrors I witnessed at Alligator Creek died with the men who created them. But I fear that I'm not. I fear that somewhere, in some secret facility, scientists are still working to create armies that can charge into battle like they cannot die. Because they saw what I saw. They know what's possible when human beings are pushed beyond the boundaries of human nature. And they know that in the next war, the side that creates the most effective monsters will be the side that wins. God help us all. That's my story. That's what I saw that night at Alligator Creek, in the year of our Lord 1942, when the world was younger and the possibilities for horror seemed endless. I'm the last one left who remembers. When I'm gone, the secret dies with me. Maybe that's for the best. Maybe some truths are too dangerous to survive. Maybe the world is better off not knowing what happened to those 37 Marines, or what the Japanese had created in their desperate final years, or what nations might still be creating in the name of victory. But I can't let it die unspoken. I can't take this secret to my grave without at least trying to warn someone somewhere about what I saw. About what's possible when human beings decide that winning is more important than staying human. They kept charging, like they couldn't die. And in the end, maybe they couldn't. Maybe we'd created something that transcended death itself, something that could fight forever in the mud and darkness of places like Alligator Creek. I hope I never have to find out if I'm right. But I fear that someday someone will.